The scaler slipped from my hand when my phone buzzed against the stainless tray. I wasn't planning to check it. I only glanced because the preview lit up bright enough to pull my eyes toward it. We just reserved the whole week of July 4th. My assistant paused mid-step. Another buzz followed right after. Everyone's coming. All 32 of us. The room felt too white, too tight. I set the phone down face first, making the motion slow and controlled because everything inside me felt the opposite. People outside the operatory were laughing about something. In here, the air thinned the way it does before someone says something they can't take back. Most of my life has felt like being close enough to hear the party but never close enough to be asked in. I grew up in that space between included and forgotten, the middle child wedge where you exist mostly to keep things running. My older brother, Callum, was the one they bragged about. My younger brother, Evan, never had to try. Charm followed him like a tailwind. And me. I became the reliable one not because I loved the role, but because someone had to absorb the things they dropped. If an appointment was missed, I fixed it. If keys or backpacks vanished, I spent the weekend searching. My mother would pat my arm and say I had a steady head. My father would nod like I had accepted a job I never applied for. Reliability sounds like a compliment, but over time it starts to feel like a cage someone locked by accident and never bothered unlocking. I learned to reduce my needs. I tracked every bill in a bent old notebook. I avoided asking for help because help always arrived with commentary. I didn't share my dreams because the moment I said them out loud, they'd get reworked into someone else's plan. But there was one thing I kept for myself, a place where I could breathe without earning the right to. That place was always the lake. Even as a kid, passing open water felt like slipping into a version of myself no one else ever met. When I found the listing for the A-frame cabin years later, it didn't feel random. It felt like finding something that had been waiting for me. I didn't tell anyone when I toured it. I didn't tell anyone when the offer was accepted or when I signed the papers with hands that shook from relief more than nerves. Only my friend Mara knew, because she understood how secrecy wasn't rudeness for me. It was self-defense. Thought I had time. I imagined showing them the place when I was ready, when the paint had dried and the shelves were up and the space felt lived in. But in my family, things don't happen at a pace you choose. They decide. They act. And then they inform you. Which is why that preview line on my phone didn't feel like news. Felt like a verdict. I didn't listen to the voicemail right away. I washed my hands, wiped down my station, went through the usual motions just to keep my breathing even. Eventually I stepped into the supply room and pressed play. My mother's voice rushed out fast and cheerful. "We booked the whole week at your lake place. Everyone's coming. All 32 of us." She sounded proud of the number like it was an accomplishment. Like filling my quiet space with dozens of voices was something I should be excited about. She listed plans, boats, grills, fireworks as if I had offered the cabin up in the first place. I closed my eyes and pictured trailers pulling into my gravel drive, people hauling coolers across the deck, kids tearing through the hallway I painted myself. The kitchen crowded. The dock shaking. The quiet drowned under the weight of people who assumed they belonged wherever they landed. They weren't asking. They were informing me. It was the same pattern as always. They assumed I'd adjust. They assumed I'd make room. They assumed my silence was approval. But this time something shifted, quiet and final, like a lock turning inside me. And they had no idea what that shift was about to set in motion. If they thought I'd bend the way I always did, they were about to learn how wrong they were. I didn't reply to my mother. I didn't even replay the message. There was no point listening twice to something that had already carved itself into my chest. Instead, I grabbed my bag, locked up the clinic room, and walked outside where the late afternoon air felt cooler and more honest than anything waiting in my phone. I drove north without music. The road stretched out in long, quiet lines, tall pines leaning over the asphalt like they were guarding a secret. With every mile, the pressure in my chest loosened. The closer I got, the more the noise from earlier faded, the more my thoughts settled in ways they never could around my family. The cabin didn't appear suddenly. It eased into view the way truth usually does. First the angle of the roof through the trees, then the warm wood siding catching the last bit of sunlight. By the time I pulled into the gravel drive, the sky had turned a soft blue-gray, and the lake reflected it like glass. Inside, the house looked exactly how I'd left it. The blue cabinets, the flannel draped over the chair, the stack of books by the window seat. Everything in its place, not because it was perfect but because it was mine. I stood in the middle of the living room and took a slow breath. The house answered back with small familiar creaks, like it had been waiting for me to return and finally claim it. After a minute I started moving. Movement helped steady me. I checked the drawers in the kitchen, the hinges on the doors, the locks on the windows. I pulled out my notebook and flipped through pages filled with years of careful planning. Every repair, every payment, every small step that made this place real. Then I opened a plain box that held the important documents. The deed, the closing papers, the receipts from every plank of wood and can of paint. I laid them out on the table, not for anyone else, but to remind myself this place wasn't a shared family asset. It wasn't a summer home. It was something I built alone. By the next morning I knew what I needed to do. The locksmith arrived right on time. He was quiet, the kind of man who worked without small talk, and I appreciated that. I showed him every exterior door and pointed out where I wanted the keypad. He didn't ask questions about why I needed new deadbolts on every entry. He didn't comment when I said I wanted the master code set to a number, only I understood. He worked with steady, purposeful sounds, metal clinking, drills humming softly. Each click felt like another boundary locking into place. When he handed me the new keys, he gave me just 2 of them. No copies, no extras, only opens for whoever you choose, he said. The words settled into me with more weight than I expected. After he left, I walked the perimeter of the cabin and tested every lock one by one. It almost felt ceremonial, each turn of the handle grounding me deeper into ownership. Not ownership on paper but ownership in action. The rest of the day I spent cleaning, even though the place barely needed it. I wiped down every surface, shook out the rugs, folded blankets, lined up the books on the shelf. None of it was necessary. But it gave my mind something to hold on to while I sorted through everything I felt. Later, as the sun started to drop, I stepped out onto the dock. The lake was calm, rippling gently under the late golden light. I dangled my feet over the edge and dipped them into the water. The cold felt sharp and grounding. Someone across the lake set off early fireworks. Sparks shot upward, bright for a moment before fading into thin smoke. The reflections broke into small ripples around my ankles. They didn't reach my shoreline. They didn't touch my quiet. Back inside, I placed the new keyring into the small wooden box I carved a year ago. It closed with a soft thud that sounded more final than any argument I could ever have with my family. I wasn't angry. I thought I would be, but anger wasn't what settled in my chest. What I felt was steadier. A decision that didn't need shouting. I turned off the exterior lights and watched the cabin fall into silhouette against the darkening water. For the first time it felt like mine in a way nothing else ever had. And just when I thought I'd finally gained control of the situation, their arrival proved I had only seen the beginning. I woke before sunrise the next morning. Not because of nerves but because the house felt different. Quieter in a way that felt intentional, almost like it was waiting for me to make the next move. Mist drifted across the lake in slow, soft lines, and the sky shifted from slate to pale lavender. I stood by the window with my hands around a warm mug and watched the light grow in thin layers. My phone buzzed on the counter. 3 missed calls. 1 from my mother, 2 from Evan. No texts, which meant they were still in the early phase of planning, where everyone assumes they just need to touch base with me and things will fall neatly into place. I didn't open anything. I flipped the phone face down the same way I had in the clinic, but this time it felt like a choice instead of a reflex. I spent the morning organizing small things around the cabin. I tightened a loose screw on the deck railing, added fresh batteries to the lanterns, unpacked a few groceries I picked up the night before. All simple tasks that kept my mind steady. It was a quiet kind of preparation, not for them but for myself. Even then, a part of me wondered if they would actually show up. A reasonable family would have paused the moment they realized I wasn't responding. They would have asked questions. They would have waited. But my family didn't pause. They acted, and expected me to adjust afterward. By early afternoon I had my answer. The first set of headlights cut through the trees long before the car reached the driveway. A bright arc sweeping across the pines like someone announcing their arrival before they even stepped onto the property. Then another set of lights appeared behind the first. Then another. I watched from the loft window as the caravan spilled into the gravel drive. Callum parked first, front and center, like he was claiming prime territory. He climbed out and slammed the door loud enough to break the peace. Evan followed, arms full of coolers, shouting directions at cousins who immediately ignored him. Then came my parents' SUV, pulling closest to the porch as if proximity would somehow equal authority. No one looked up at the window. They didn't even consider the fact that I might be inside watching them. They moved like people who already owned the place. I stayed where I was until I saw my mother pick up 2 grocery bags and march confidently toward the porch. She had a bright, practiced smile on her face, the kind she used at family gatherings when she wanted everyone to stay calm and impressed. She reached for the doorknob and twisted it like she expected it to swing open. It didn't move. She jiggled it, confused, then checked her purse for a key that didn't exist. I walked downstairs and opened the door myself. The sound was small, but the impact wasn't. "Hi, Mom," I said, calm and steady. Her smile flickered. For a moment I saw surprise, then irritation, then something sharper she tried to hide. "Sweetheart, the lock must be sticking." "These old cabins, it's not sticking," I said. "It's new." Dad stepped closer, scanning the porch like he was inspecting a misaligned blueprint. Callum grinned and spoke first. "Ro, this place is unreal. Wait till you see the boat we brought. Kids are dying to get inside." "There's no boat launch on my property," I said. Evan laughed his usual easy laugh, the one he used when he assumed I'd come around eventually. "Don't be weird. Mom said you were fine with it." I looked at her. I didn't raise my voice, didn't accuse, didn't apologize. I simply held her eyes long enough for the truth to settle. "I wasn't asked," I said. The words fell heavy, leaving no space for interpretation. The next few minutes played out like a machine malfunctioning in slow motion. Mom tried guilt first. Dad switched to family doctrine. Callum called me dramatic. Evan framed it like convenience. Behind them, relatives started unloading anyway, setting down bags, dragging foldable tables, making themselves comfortable. And then, just as a child began sprinting toward the dock, the final line inside me snapped into clarity. I stepped back into the house, placed my hand on the door and closed it. The deadbolt clicked into place in one clean, undeniable motion. The shouting started immediately. But the real turning point wasn't the locked door. It was what happened when they refused to give up the moment the deadbolt clicked. Everything outside shifted. At first it was confusion, the kind that sounds like a jumble of half-finished sentences. Then came the complaints. My mother's voice rose above everyone else, sharp at the edges. Callum kept rattling the doorknob like force could change the reality he didn't want to accept. Someone tried the back door. Someone else knocked hard enough to shake the frame. For a while, I just stood there in the entryway with my hand still on the lock, letting the noise roll over me without sinking in. Felt strange, almost surreal. Not the chaos itself, I'd lived with that energy my whole life, but the fact that it no longer pulled me into automatic fixing mode. I didn't reach for the door. I didn't apologize. I didn't soften anything. Eventually the noise outside lost its intensity, and what settled in its place was something quieter but heavier. The kind of pause when people realize a boundary isn't a phase. My phone vibrated on the counter. Then again. Calls, texts, voicemails, each one trying a different angle. Mom started with disappointment, then moved to guilt, then confusion. Dad left a message quoting something about family unity. Callum sent a long paragraph about how I was overreacting. Evan tried to play mediator with a soft, "We just want to talk." I didn't answer any of it. I turned off the exterior lights instead, watching the porch fall into shadow, then the side path, then the deck. One switch at a time until the cabin blended into the trees, quiet and uninviting, a silhouette only I had the key to brighten again. Not long after, I heard tires crunching on gravel again, but this time slower, more official. A knock came at the door, steady and calm. Juliet. Sheriff's Department. I opened the door just enough to see him. He had a tired but neutral expression, the look of someone who'd already been warned he was stepping into family drama. "They're insisting you let them in," he said. "I just need to confirm who owns the property." I handed him the folder I'd pulled from the drawer earlier. A deed. The closing paperwork. The insurance documents. Nothing emotional, nothing defensive. Just facts. He scanned the name, matched it to my ID, nodded once, and turned back toward the crowd gathered by the porch. "She's the owner," he said clearly. "Entry is at her discretion." The silence that followed was heavy enough to feel through the floorboards. First no one moved. Then a few relatives muttered under their breaths. Someone kicked at gravel. Evan put his hands on his hips and looked away. Mom covered her mouth like she'd been personally betrayed. Dad stared at the sheriff like he was waiting for him to reconsider. But the sheriff simply tipped his hat, gave me a polite nod, and walked back to his car. When his taillights disappeared through the trees, the reality finally settled on everyone. There was nothing left to negotiate. No loophole. No emotional pressure point they could use to slip inside. They retreated to the public access area down the road, the only spot they legally had left to occupy. I sat on the dock as the sky shifted into night. The lake was still, except for the slow drag of a breeze pushing across the surface. A few distant voices drifted from the direction of the public shoreline. Small arguments, frustrated murmurs, the hum of plans falling apart. The sound didn't reach me clearly. It just skimmed over the water like something that no longer belonged to my world. Above me, the northern lights began to rise. Soft colors first. Then brighter streaks, rolling across the sky in slow waves. I wrapped a blanket around my shoulders and watched it all in silence. The house behind me was warm. The lake in front of me was calm. For the first time in my life, I wasn't holding tension for anybody else. I wasn't cushioning a blow. I wasn't translating discomfort. I was just here. They expected a vacation. What they got was a line they couldn't step over. In the distance, someone slammed a car door. Someone else complained about bugs. Child started crying. The whole scene played out like a lesson they weren't ready to learn. And for once, that wasn't my problem. But the fallout that came the next morning was something none of us could have predicted. By the time the sun came up the next morning, the shoreline was empty again. Whatever frustration they carried from the night before had either burned off or worn them out. I didn't hear the usual mix of arguing, planning, or bossing around that usually followed my family wherever they went. Just the quiet sound of the lake settling into its morning rhythm. I stepped out onto the deck with a mug of hot coffee and let the cool boards warm under my feet. The mist hovered low and slow, thinning in soft ribbons as the light grew. For the first time in days, maybe weeks, my shoulders dropped without effort. There were no footsteps behind me. No sudden demands. No voices calling my name. Just space. I moved through the cabin in an unhurried way, touching the things I'd worked for. The cabinet doors I sanded until my arms burned. The rug I saved up for. The stack of plates Mara and I found during one of our weekend thrift runs. Everything was exactly where I'd left it. That simple fact felt like a win by itself. My phone sat on the counter, screen dark. A handful of missed calls, but fewer than the day before. No new messages. That was unusual for them. They weren't giving me space out of respect. They were recalibrating. Silence was just their way of gathering new angles, deciding which tactic might get them what they wanted next. I didn't rush to fill the quiet. I didn't reach for the phone. I let the stillness sit the same way a lake rests after a long wind. Untroubled. By late morning, I decided to walk the small path along the shoreline. The dogs from the neighboring cabin weren't out yet, so the trail was clean and undisturbed. I followed the curve of the water, brushing my fingers across wildflowers growing along the edge. A few dragonflies hovered close, wings flashing in the sun. For once, I wasn't thinking about what someone else needed from me. I wasn't anticipating a problem or preparing a fix. I was simply walking, breathing, existing in a way that almost felt unfamiliar. Growing up, I thought peace would eventually come when someone finally understood me. When my parents noticed the weight I carried. When my brothers realized how much space they took up. But standing there on the trail, watching ripples soften until they disappeared, I realized something I should have understood years ago. Peace doesn't depend on being understood. Comes from choosing yourself even when nobody agrees with the choice. I spent part of the afternoon reading in the window seat, letting the sun shift across the floor while the breeze pushed gently through the open window. Later I went down to the dock and let the water run over my hand, cool and steady. Time moved differently here, slower but fuller. At some point, a car engine rumbled in the distance. Not close, not threatening, just passing. And for once, it didn't trigger the usual bracing instinct inside me. I didn't assume someone was arriving with expectations. I didn't prepare for another confrontation. My body stayed loose, grounded. That alone told me just how deeply I'd needed this break from them. As evening settled, the sky took on that rich, deep blue that only shows up after a clear day. I sat on the deck with a blanket around my shoulders, watching the last bit of light fade over the water. The air smelled like pine and cool earth, and the moment felt like an exhale I'd been waiting years to release. I didn't know what would happen next with my family. I didn't know when the next conversation would happen or what shape it would take. I didn't plan any speeches. I didn't rehearse any explanations. I let the uncertainty sit near me like another presence on the deck. Quiet, neutral, no longer something to fear. Because whatever came next, I wasn't walking into it the same person they'd always depended on to smooth things over. The lake had shown me something simple but important. My life didn't disappear when I stopped accommodating everyone else. But peace never lasts long when a family like mine decides they aren't done. And the message I received that night proved just how far they were willing to push. The message came just after sunset, when the sky had turned deep blue and the last bit of warmth was slipping out of the air. I had stepped inside to make tea, letting the kettle warm slowly while the cabin settled around me with soft, familiar creaks. The phone buzzed on the counter. Not the rapid kind that meant a call. Just one quiet alert. For a moment I considered ignoring it. But something in my chest nudged me to look. It was from my mother. Not a paragraph. Not a guilt-laced voice memo. Just 8 words. We need to talk. It can't wait anymore. I stared at the screen for a long moment, letting the weight of the sentence settle. It wasn't an apology. It wasn't accountability. It wasn't even anger. It was her way of signaling that another round of pressure was about to start. My family never went silent. They paused only long enough to change tactics. I didn't respond. I placed the phone face down on the table and stepped outside with my mug. The night air felt cool, brushing across my skin, steadying me more than anything I could have said back. The truth was simple. Whatever she wanted to tell me, it could wait. I sat on the edge of the dock, letting the steam from my tea curl into the darkness. The water reflected the moon in long, wavering lines. Even the trees seemed to listen. I wasn't naive enough to think the worst was behind me. Not with a family who never learned the difference between sharing and taking. They weren't done. They were regrouping. And the message confirmed it. Later that night I walked back inside and opened the notebook I kept tucked in the drawer near the window. Not the pages with payments or repairs. Those were things I wrote down to keep the cabin organized. This was the section where I kept pieces of myself. Lines I wrote when emotions were too sharp to leave floating in my mind. I turned to a blank page. For a long moment I didn't write anything. I just let the quiet settle. Then I wrote one sentence. I don't owe anyone access to my peace. The words looked simple on the page, but they felt bigger than any conversation I'd ever had with my family. I closed the notebook and leaned back in the chair, letting the calm sink in. Eventually, I went upstairs to the loft and watched the lake through the window. The sky was clear, pinpricked with stars. The kind of night that felt honest. And just as I was beginning to drift towards sleep, headlights flashed across the far end of the lake. Not close, not pulling into my drive, but turning down the public access road again. They were back. Even from a distance, I could tell the mood was different. No laughter. No confidence. Just slow-moving shapes, like people who didn't know what to do next but weren't ready to leave the field entirely. I stayed by the window and watched them move around in the dim light. Few silhouettes pacing. Someone pointing toward the cabin. Someone else shaking their head. It had the look of a group trying to coordinate a plan they couldn't agree on. And then my father stepped into the strongest patch of moonlight. Even at a distance, his posture was unmistakable, upright, stiff, full of certainty. He had always carried authority like a shield. And for a moment he just stood there, staring in the direction of the cabin. The message from my mother made sense then. They wanted another push. One more attempt. One more angle to get inside the house, inside my decision, inside my boundaries. I curled my fingers around the railing of the loft and let the cool wood anchor me. I wasn't afraid. Not anymore. I closed the curtains slowly, one side at a time, and let the cabin return to its soft darkness. The only light came from the small lamp near my bed, warm and steady. The kind of light that didn't demand anything from me. What they wanted could wait. What they thought they deserved could wait. Everything could wait. Because the truth was clear now. This was the first time in my life I wasn't going to step toward their expectations. I was staying exactly where I needed to be. But the final confrontation, the one that changed everything, didn't happen on the road or through messages. It happened face to face the next morning, and it forced every buried truth to the surface. I woke to the sound of gravel shifting under slow tires. Not the loud, chaotic arrival from days earlier. This was quieter, more deliberate. The kind of approach people make when they've decided the conversation will happen on their terms, no matter what you prefer. I didn't rush to the window. I took a moment to stretch, to feel my feet on the floor, to remind myself that I didn't need to meet anyone in panic. When I finally walked to the loft railing and looked down toward the driveway, I saw the small group standing by the porch. My parents, Callum, Evan. No cousins. No coolers. No noise. Just the four people who had shaped most of the patterns I spent years trying to untangle. For a few seconds no one moved. They didn't knock. They didn't call out. They just stood there, all of them carrying a different version of the same expectation. That I'd open the door because I always had before. I walked downstairs with calm, steady steps and opened the door halfway, keeping the frame between us like a polite but unmistakable boundary. My mother spoke first. "Juliet, this has gone on long enough." Gone on long enough. Familiar phrase. The kind she used whenever my feelings became inconvenient. I didn't respond right away. I waited for her to continue. "We didn't come to fight," she said, softening her tone. "We came to talk." Dad nodded like that confirmed some agreement they'd decided privately. Evan kept his hands in his pockets, avoiding my eyes. Callum stood with his arms crossed, impatient already. I didn't invite them in. I didn't open the door any wider. Instead, I stepped just enough into the doorway that they could see I was listening, but not yielding. My father exhaled sharply. "Family doesn't shut each other out," he said. "You made your point. Now open the door so we can handle this like adults." I held his gaze. "I'm not shutting anyone out. I'm holding a boundary." Dad's jaw tightened. Mom stepped forward slightly, like she wanted to reach for my arm the way she used to when she wanted to steer me. I stayed exactly where I was. "Sweetheart," she said, "you know we didn't mean to upset you." "You didn't ask if you would," I said gently. "You assumed you wouldn't." That landed harder than any raised voice could have. Callum huffed. "Ro, you're blowing this out of proportion. It's a house. Or family. Families share. It's my house, I said, steady and calm. I built this without anyone's help. Not because I didn't want you in my life, but because this was the first thing that was mine. They didn't interrupt me, but their expressions shifted: confusion from Evan, irritation from Callum, disbelief from Dad, and something softer, more unsure, from Mom. 4 years, I continued. I've adjusted to everyone's expectations. I've carried things you never even noticed. When you decided to use this cabin for 32 people without asking me, it wasn't just inconsiderate. It was a reminder of every time you assumed I'd make space simply because you wanted something. No one spoke. And for the first time, I said, I didn't adjust. Mom's eyes moved past me, scanning the inside of the cabin like she could already see where she wanted things to go. It was instinctive for her. Habit. But she didn't step forward. Instead, her voice softened to something closer to honesty. We didn't realize, she whispered. I know, I said. That's the point. Evan finally looked up. So what now? Now, said. I take some space. And you respect that. Callum opened his mouth to argue but caught himself. Dad looked like he'd swallowed something sharp. Mom blinked, processing a reality she'd never expected to face. I didn't wait for them to come up with counterarguments. This doesn't mean I don't love you, I added. It means I'm done disappearing to keep the peace. There it was. The truth that had been waiting years to become words. My mother nodded slowly. My father looked away. Evan gave a small, reluctant nod. Callum shook his head, not fully understanding but finally realizing resistance wasn't going to work. None of them pushed past me. None of them tried to step inside. They backed away one by one, not in defeat, but in recognition. They left quietly. When their cars finally disappeared into the trees, the silence that followed wasn't heavy. It didn't feel like a loss. It felt earned. I closed the door, locked it with a new deadbolt, and leaned against it for a moment, not from exhaustion, but from relief. The cabin hummed softly in the background. The lake outside was steady and bright with morning light. For the first time in my life, the quiet didn't feel like something I had to protect. It felt like something that finally belonged to me. And if you've ever reached a moment where choosing yourself changed everything, then you already know this is just the beginning of a different kind of story.